Hello and welcome. Today, we're taking a close look at paper 30 from the non-holomorphic fractal series. Now, the previous papers in this series found something really surprising. It looked like a fundamental constant in chaos theory. The Feigenbaum singularity was completely destroyed by a certain kind of mathematical change. But here's the catch. They only saw this through one specific lens, just one way of measuring the system, and that leaves us with a massive question, which is what this whole analysis is about today.
Okay, so let's quickly set the stage. Papers 26 through 29 really nail down a key finding. When you take a specific chaotic system, this thing called the Bird-Map, and you break a really important mathematical property called holomorphy, you can kind of think of it as a type of geometric smoothness. The classic Feigenbaum structure just vanishes. But, and this is the crucial part, they only saw this happen for one single way of measuring things, the Orbit-Multiplier. It's like looking at a huge complex landscape through one very specific, very powerful telescope.
And that brings us right to the heart of paper 30. Is this destruction a universal truth for the whole system, or was it just a weird artifact of the particular telescope we happen to be looking through? You know, if we switch our lens, if we measure the system's chaos in a totally different way, are we going to see the same thing, or does a completely new picture pop into view?
So to figure this out, we're going to follow the paper's investigation step by step. First, we'll build what it calls an atlas of different ways to look at the system. Then we'll dive into the evidence that, and this is wild, points to two completely separate bands of behavior. We'll see how the paper gets rigorous about this with two theorems, one that's fully proven and another that's conditional. And all of this leads to a bold new conjecture, and finally, a clear roadmap for what comes next.
All right, so to really dig into this question, we first need to build up our toolkit. The paper makes it clear that there isn't just one way to describe this system's behavior. We can actually look at it through many different mathematical lenses, or what are called observables.
The paper has this great name for it, the Borel Coefficient Atlas, and it's a perfect metaphor, really. Think about an atlas of the world. You could have a political map, a topographical map, a climate map. They're all describing the same planet, but they each highlight totally different features. Well, here, each map is a sequence, or a ladder, of mathematical coefficients that you get from a unique observable, and each one gives us a different view of the same underlying chaos.
So up to this point in the series, we've really only studied one map in this whole atlas in any detail, the one from the Orbit-Multiplier. And we know it pretty well. Its coefficients grow at a very specific rate, what's called an exponential type, we call it rho, and it's about 0.19. The little fluctuations around that growth are tiny, really well behaved, and they follow a statistical rule called the law of the iterated logarithm, or LIL. And most importantly, all of this is explained by a rigorously proven mathematical result called a decoupling identity. This basically proves that the chaos is driving the behavior in a predictable way. Okay, so this is our home base, our well-understood territory.
All right, now for the new investigation. The paper's first move is to run what it calls Phase 1 diagnostics. This means taking two new maps from our atlas, which are generated by different observables. These new ones are related to something called Watson-Borel theory, which is just another mathematical lens we can use. Then we're going to compare them directly to our baseline, the Orbit-Multiplier ladder.
Now, just look at the raw data here for a second. Check out the column labeled rho n. That's the exponential type. The Orbit-Multiplier is sitting right where we expect it at 0.19. But the other two, these are Watson proxies, basically stand-ins for this first test. They're completely different, hanging out around 0.79 and 0.87. Now look at the last column, the residual standard deviation. For the Orbit-Multiplier, it's tiny, 0.13, just as expected. The Watson proxies, they're almost 1.0. These numbers aren't just a little bit different. They're in completely different universes.
And this plot, man, it just makes the difference crystal clear. It's showing the logarithm of the coefficient sizes. That orange line, the Orbit-Multiplier, is plunging downwards in this perfectly predictable straight line. That's that exponential growth we were talking about. But the other two, the Watson proxies in blue and green, they're just kind of sitting there. They're nearly flat and really noisy. They're behaving in a fundamentally different way. This is the visual smoking gun.
But okay, before we get too carried away with this new discovery, we need to check something. Is our original Orbit-Multiplier result even stable, or was it just a fluke? Well, this table shows it absolutely is. The parameter epsilon here just controls how strong the perturbation is, and as you can see, for different strengths, 0.5, 0.8, 1.0, the exponential type, that rho n, stays in a really tight range from about 0.14 to 0.19. So this confirms it forms a stable, well-defined band of behavior. So here's the punchline, the big takeaway from all this. The exponential type that you get is not a universal property of the system. The answer to our big question from the beginning is a clear no. It fundamentally depends on what you choose to measure.
And to really make this tangible, let's just see how far apart these things are. The orbit band, based on our original measurement, is down here between about 0.14 and 0.19, but the Watson band, from the data our proxies gave us, is way up here between 0.79 and 0.87. They are not even close. We're talking about a separation by a factor of 4 to 6. This isn't some subtle little effect. It's a massive qualitative difference in how the system behaves, and it all depends on your observable.
Now, this numerical evidence is incredibly compelling, but in mathematical physics, you need rigor. So the next part of the paper formalizes all this with two key results. And it's really, really important that we're clear about the difference between what is fully proven and what is still a very well-supported but not yet proven hypothesis.
First up, we've got Theorem 3.1. This is the big result for the orbit band. Informally, it proves that the behavior we saw in the data is real and mathematically sound. It confirms that the decoupling identity holds, that those tiny fluctuations are governed by a specific statistical law, and, this is crucial, it proves that the exponential type, ρ, is pinned down precisely by the average value of the observable along its chaotic path.
And listen, the most important thing to get here is that this result is unconditional. It stands on its own. It's fully proved using all the mathematical machinery that was built up in the previous papers. This is solid ground.
Now, let's contrast that with the Watson band. The paper presents something called Lemma 4.1. And what it says is this: if a similar decoupling identity also holds for these Watson-type observables, then their exponential type should be pinned exactly where the data suggests. But that if is everything. Remember, the data we saw for the Watson band came from proxies, from stand-ins, not the real deal. So the result for the Watson band is conditional. It depends on an assumption that hasn't been proven yet. This intellectual honesty, drawing a razor-sharp line between the proven and the hypothesized, is what makes this paper so rigorous.
Okay, so where does that leave us? We have one proven, solid as a rock band of behavior, and we have very strong evidence for a second one, even if it's still conditional. This is what leads the paper to propose a new, much grander theory that can actually explain both of these findings at once.
And here it is. Conjecture 5.1, the multi-band universality conjecture. It proposes that instead of a single universal behavior, the system is neatly organized into a finite number of distinct bands. It suggests that any reasonable way you could measure this system will have to fall into one of these predefined universality classes. And the orbit band and the Watson band? They're just the first two we've managed to discover.
So in short, multi-band universality is this pretty radical idea that this chaotic system doesn't have one single governing law, but maybe a handful of them. The system's properties get sorted into different bins, or bands. And which bin you're in depends entirely on how you look at it. This completely replaces the old idea of a single universal constant with a new, much richer structure.
A conjecture is a powerful thing, but it demands to be tested. And the final section of paper 30 does exactly that. It lays out a very clear, very concrete plan to test this new theory, and specifically to turn the conditional result for the Watson band into an unconditional one.
And here's the plan. It's a methodical, 4-step research program. First, you adapt the code that generated the original Orbit-Multiplier coefficients. Second, you define a new observable, but this time using the actual Watson kernel from the earlier papers, not the proxies. Third, you run a pilot study to generate a brand new true ladder of coefficients. And finally, you apply the exact same diagnostic test we saw before and see where it lands. Does it fall in the Watson band, the orbit band, or maybe somewhere else entirely?
And, without spoiling too much, the paper points us forward. The next chapter in this story, paper 31, actually does this. It carries out the plan and provides the first direct numerical evidence, a true witness, that confirms the Watson band is real. The conditional result gets anchored in numerical fact, which makes the whole multi-band picture that much stronger.
So, that's where we'll end. We started with what looked like a broken universal law, and we've ended up with this new, much more complex picture of a multi-band universe. It's a great story of how a deeper look can reveal a structure that's so much richer than we first imagined. And it leaves us with this really tantalizing final question. We found 2 bands, but if the universe of this map really is partitioned this way, how many more are still out there just waiting to be discovered?